too much, I'm waiting on the copies anyway. Last week it was brought up the idea, and I wanted to make sure that I hit this because I don't want anybody thinking anything incorrectly. Last week it was brought up the idea of, in Revelation it talks about a new heaven and a new earth. There's two separate instances where it talks about that. We had just begun our study, and the question was asked about what does that mean? What is this new heaven and this new earth? Is it a dwelling place? And we've kind of determined that it is not a physical dwelling place, but just real quickly, just for your edification, Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through about 4, it talks about it. And I can see that there's no other understanding of this other than, let's read it. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. We have to understand that this is not a description of heaven, so to speak. It's not talking about heaven. Heaven will never come down. We ascend to heaven. It says Christ will come, and he will receive us to himself. The heaven is never coming down to take the place of the earth that we have now. This description of this new heaven and new earth can only be that of the Christian age, what we would call the latter days, the days of Christianity, and it talks about that. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. For the first time, we have that access to him. So I just want everybody to understand that last week we were not talking about the doing away with this earthly dwelling place and another one taking its place. It is talking about the church. And I just want to make sure everybody understood that before we went any further. Okay. All right. Let me pull up. I think I've got a copy of this here. All right. We talked last week about the transfiguration. And what does it mean, of course, by transfiguration? Where do we read about the transfiguration? Okay. In Matthew chapter 17. And as soon as I get my paper back, we'll start turning to some of this. But we talked about a couple of this is a revelation. Okay. That'll work. It takes a couple minutes for that copier to come on. Okay. We talked about this last week a little bit. How the idea, and we got down to the final. What our final point was last week. Peter's problem. This idea of Peter failed to realize that before Christ could come as king, he must first come as Savior. This understanding, this misconception that Christ was going to be an earthly king. I mean, they even nailed that to the top of his cross. So you could tell this was very first and foremost. That's how they were able to convict him and sentence him to death, was the idea that he would be a king. And of course, they proposed the idea that he was trying to usurp the authority of Caesar. And in that way, they were able to get a charge of sedition against him. But we understand that he reigns as king. We talked about that, why the people rejected him as king. All right? So we understand that he was going to come as king, but we have to understand first that he must come as a savior. He must first come to save us. And it was only after his death that he became our king. It was only after his death. It wouldn't have worked any other way. Exactly. They saw him in the true sense. And when he on that Mount of Transfiguration, you remember it shows each of the ways that Christ was going to occupy a place in our hearts. Remember, we have Isaiah who is manifested, right? What does he represent? Prophet. Okay. Then we have Moses as the lawgiver, and then we have Christ as the king. The only person in history to ever occupy all three of those positions. He is a lawgiver, he is a prophet, and he is a king. Okay? So it's important that we realize that Christ must come as a Savior. He comes to save our souls. That's why he was here. He died on the cross so that we might have redemption. And then after that, he cannot possibly reign in our hearts as a king unless he first occupies a position as Savior, right? All these people who say, oh, Christ reigns in my life and Christ has complete control. If they are not New Testament Christians, can Christ occupy that position as king? No. They must be in subjection to him in all ways. Not just saying, I believe who he is. Not just, I believe what he says. I must obey him. I must obey him. Sir, absolutely. So, The Jews knew that this Christ the King, he must live and he must reign forever and ever, but with the understanding that this would be an earthly kingdom, of course, they had a hard time conceptualizing what Christ truly meant as reigning in their lives and reigning as king. Okay? So they face what seems to be an impossible problem. And on the surface, it certainly does. How can a dead Messiah reign forever as king? Makes sense. When a king's dead, what happens? Someone else takes over. So if this Jesus was to perish or die in some way, whatever it might be, I'll give you that one back because I got one now. All right. So, if Jesus were to die, what would the perception of most people be if a king was to die? You know, there'd be no kingship, or he's figured out somebody else to reign in his place. This led to a lot of misconception about Peter's role in the new church, right? Jesus is gone. Now Peter basically fulfills his role. There is no coincidence that the Pope, the Roman Catholic Pope, is called the Vicar of Christ on earth. He reigns on earth in place of Christ. Well, what does that do? Where does that leave Christ? If the Pope reigns on earth in place of Christ, where's that? Can we have two kings? No, it doesn't work that way. Okay? Exactly right. Exactly right. And any authority that's here, that is on this earth, has been given by Christ in a particular fashion. The authority of the elders, where do they derive that authority? They derive that authority from Christ, because Christ has the power to grant that authority. Do they have any power that Christ has not granted them? No. And more elderships would do well to consider that. You know, they have a particular authority, and that's where their authority begins, and that's where their authority ends, in a particular fashion. The apostles, did the apostles have all authority on earth? No. They had the authority that was given to them by Christ. So the idea, how can this dead Messiah, this Messiah that's been crucified, he's been nailed to the cross, and as far as they're concerned, that was the end of it. He's dead, he's in the ground. Now what happens? How can a dead Messiah reign forever? Okay? How did God solve this problem? All right? And, well, let's look at this. I asked 4 questions. There's 4 ways that this can happen. 1, by fulfilling his word concerning the death of the Messiah, but disregarding those passages that speak of the kingdom of the Messiah. There's one option. God has 4. By sending 2 different Messiahs, one who would suffer and die, and another that would reign as king. Well, we know that can't be right. By having the Messiah avoid death and march directly to the throne. Well, that can't work. You know, he has to die. That's how, God has always required blood sacrifice. Jesus was no exception. Jesus' blood had to be shed. So that doesn't work either. He's either going to be a king in that case, or he's going to be a Messiah. One of the two. Well, Jesus is both. So the only other option is this: by having by resurrection, one Messiah but 2 separate comings. There was a coming in the flesh, and then there was a coming in the spirit. Okay. So, which of the above was Peter's solution? Number 3, right? By having the Messiah avoid death and march directly to the throne. That's what Peter was hoping. Remember, what was Peter's rebuke of Jesus? The rebuke. He said, "Far be it from this happen to you." This, in some translations, it says, "This shall not happen." After Jesus just said, "This is what must happen," with the understanding that any instruction comes directly from God. So basically, who is Peter rebuking? He's rebuking God himself. God said this, my Father said this must happen. No, this must not happen, or this shall not happen. Well, Peter is basically telling God, you don't know what you're talking about. This can't happen. Now, do you think Peter was coming from a position of, I know better than God? What do you think Peter's reasoning was behind it? Okay. He's looking at it from a friend standpoint, right? You know, as Peter grows to love Jesus and grows to appreciate him as a person, last thing he wants to do is see his friend taken away, especially one that spoke to him as no one else ever had, who told him things no one else has ever been able to tell him, even things that were not found in Mosaic law. He was able to explain things. He was able to give them insight into mysteries that the Jews had not begun to fathom. These things have been debated for time immemorial. And all of a sudden, he's telling him that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, be accused, be convicted by the rulers, by the priests and scribes, and then he must die. But then he will be raised in 3 days. I wonder if Peter maybe didn't hear that last part. As soon as he heard the word die, he kind of shut down, and that was the extent of it. I don't know. But that was the case. Peter's desire was that Jesus avoid death and go directly to the throne. Well, that doesn't work. Of course, since Peter didn't understand God's solution, I take, some of this is from another Bible study. But I kind of take exception to the idea of the solution. Solution implies that there's a problem. Is there a problem with what was going on? No. There's no problem with God's plan. No matter, it's funny, no matter how hard we try, we cannot throw a monkey wrench into God's work. We just can't. I've debated this with people before. Can we thwart God? Listen, people stronger than we have, smarter than me, certainly, Satan has more power than I do, physically and spiritually. He has more power. But has Satan ever been able to thwart God's plan? Well, if Satan can't thwart it, what hope do we possibly have as human beings of thwarting God's plan? We can't. Okay, so I think that I'm not quite comfortable with that idea of God's solution. But he didn't understand God's plan. He didn't understand God's procedure for going through with what he wanted to do. So since he didn't understand this procedure, he didn't understand the plan. It was couched in kind of hidden language, the idea of the serpent and the heel and the bruising and the crushing and that, and not quite understand that, he became kind of disturbed at the thought of Jesus' death. What's going to happen to the king? If the king dies, will there still be a kingdom? The apostles scattered after the crucifixion. They were going to their homes and they were thinking, they were scared, they were worried, they were talking, and well, I thought, and there's all kinds of confusion, but of course, in 2 days' time, Jesus was going to come and he was going to comfort them and say, you see, I told you. What's that? That he will come back? All right. Hang on a second. Let me. All right. It says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he had done. So Jesus is announcing a pretty big event. And what's this event? His second coming. This is the one that ends it all. This is the one that brings to an end everything that has been started from the beginning of time, as we understand it to now. This is what's going to end it all. All right. So if Christ must die, then he must come again. Otherwise, if Christ doesn't come again, then he's still in the tomb, and that doesn't work either. Okay. So those scriptures which were not fulfilled at the Lord's first coming must be fulfilled at the second coming, right? Which is what? He's going to receive the church to himself. Those things were prophesied. He was going to receive the church to himself. What else has been prophesied that didn't happen at the first coming? The destruction of the world. That's been the Jews were even told that this world was not a forever world. This was a temporary thing, and that we were sojourners on this earth. And our true dwelling place is not on this earth. So even the Jews were told that the world was not going to last forever. But was that fulfilled when Christ came the first time? Or when he's going to come the second time? Second time, of course. All right? So there's some things that were not fulfilled at the Lord's first coming that must, of necessity, be fulfilled at the second time. The idea of claiming the church. The idea of confessing our names before our Father in heaven. All of those things. He's told that he was going to do them, but he hasn't done them yet. He can't do that until, of course, he goes to live with his Father, and that's where he is now. Okay. So when the Jews read the scriptures, how many comings did they see coming? They only saw what? One, right? That's the only one they saw. That's the only one in their view of the scriptures. That's the only coming that made any difference. That first one, because they were looking at him as the deliverer, not understanding what he was truly going to deliver them from. He's thinking he's going to deliver them from earthly bondage, and he's not. He's here to release us from spiritual bondage, so forth and so on, okay? So today we're living between the two comings of Christ. Do we know how long that's going to be? Nope. Does Jesus know how long it's going to be? No. Only the Father. And only the Father is going to be the one to send him back. Okay? So we are living between these two great comings of the Christ. Now, according to Matthew 16, verse 18, what has Christ been doing following his death? Right? What's that again? He's building his church. He's continuing to add to it. Or the Lord's adding to it, but that's what he's doing. He's building his church. The church is going to continue on. It's going to have pinnacles of greatness as far as influence and power and strength and all that. And then it's going to have low points. And we talked about those. I think we talked about one time the church through the ages and how the church was at one time, it's never been really big according to the population, but sometimes it's been much larger. And then there was a period of time where the church was almost unheard of. It was in hiding in some places. In some places it had dwindled down to nothing. But I think we even read about some instances where they found what can only be examples of the first century church in England and Scotland and in Europe and all of those places. But it doesn't matter what the waves of the world and what the winds of change do. The church remains first and foremost in the mind of God. He's always concerned about it. He's always careful about it. Okay, so that's what Christ has been doing following his death and prior to his coming as king. He's been building the church, and it continues to grow, and it continues to thrive, and it continues to do all the things it needs to do, and it's patiently waiting. It's one of the hardest things to do as a Christian, isn't it? Just wait, not knowing. Am I going to see the second coming of Christ, or am I going to pass on before that point? I don't know, but that's what's going to happen. No, absolutely. We're a day closer than we were yesterday, and God has a time in mind. God knows all. He knows when He's going to send it, but we have to understand that our time frame, our understanding of it is not the same as God's. We think it's been 2,000 years. Well, that's nothing. You're talking about an eternal God. 2,000 years is nothing to Him. And I'll continue to let it grow. The church is going to fall out of favor. Make no mistake about it. Time is cyclical, and believe me, we're going to go through a period of time where the church is not going to be loved. It's not going to be appreciated. It's going to be hunted. It's going to be persecuted. And before we sit there and say, "Oh, poor us," listen. Why do we feel that we're any better than the first century Christians who had to deal with that? We're no better than they are. I think it might do the church some good to actually have to work and to maybe, I don't want to say fear, because I don't think that's what God wants, but to actually look at it and say, you know what, I've got to determine for myself whether I'm going to be faithful in the face of persecution. Because you know what, I think it's sad to say that I think there's a great many people, if there was much persecution, there'd be such a falling away that it would be sad to watch. But nothing different than the first century, second century, third century had to deal with. They did the same thing. So it's going to happen. As we read our Bible today in the church age, the age of Christ, we have the advantage, of course, being able to see two distinct comings of Christ. One coming is now history, of course. It's in the rearview mirror, and one is coming in the future. Now, of course, God says, you're not going to be able to tell He's coming by all of the events of the world, right? We talked about that in Revelation. How many people misconstrue Revelation, and they think, well, I think we've plotted. We believe there's been more hurricanes, and there's been more earthquakes, and there's been more wars, and all of these things. And this is definitely pointing us to the coming of Christ, and the building of the nation of Israel, and all of those things. He said, if you can't plot God's timeline on man's timeline. He said, you're going to see all of these things. You're going to hear rumors. You're going to hear all of these things. You don't need to worry about any of that. You're not going to be able to determine when God is going to send His Son. So where does that leave us as Christians? All right. What's that? Okay. Live every day as if this may be your last one. And the truth of the matter is, we're far more likely to die of natural causes or an accident than we are to live until the second coming anyway. So where should we really be needing to think about what's happening in this day and age? Yeah, that's right. We need to be prepared at all times to meet God. All right? Oh, sure. Y2K. Oh, yeah, there's a lot of, we had people thinking the world was coming to an end, and we had people believing that we're going to devolve into chaos, and, that. Yeah. What does it say about fleeing to the mountains? Yeah. You can't hide from God. I don't care where you go. You can't hide from the judgment. You can't do any of that. All right, so here just a couple verses in regards to that. Guess what? God's never left us in the dark, right? He's always told us so. Just a couple verses really quickly. Micah 5, verse 2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little amongst the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that which is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. And what coming is that talking about? Which coming? What coming? First coming, right? His birth. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David, and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. What's he talking about? What are they talking about there? Talking about the first coming or the second coming? Okay. And what is he talking about when it talks about his the increase of his government and peace? There shall be no end. It's coming of the church, right? Okay. And we read about the church, but that's in this age. That's not in the age to come, right? Okay. Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. You can compare this to Luke 4, verses 18 through 19. Of course, you see the parallel between the two, and the quote. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. What is he talking about there? Talking about the second coming, right? Look what he says. To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. What day is God's vengeance going to happen? Is it today? Is it in this age? No. Said, vengeance is whose? God's. He will repay. Is he going to repay in this life or the next? Is God going to repay in this life? Not typically. What happens in this life? You might get arrested, you might go to jail, but that's the government of men. God is going to truly repay. And it's going to make the prison of men seem like nothing. You'll wish you could go back to maximum security prison when you have the choice between that and hell. Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt the foal of an ass. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace unto the heathen. And his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth. It's got to be in this age, right? I mean, everything about that. The idea of riding, coming into Jerusalem on the donkey, and the idea of he shall speak peace unto the heathen. What is he talking about there? Okay. All right, absolutely. Speaking peace unto the heathen. What does that mean? Gentiles, right? The Gentiles now have access to God that they didn't have before. Okay? Absolutely. Isaiah 40, verses 3 through 5. You can see, compare there to Matthew 3:3 and Mark 1:3. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Is that the first, after the first coming or the second? Yes. Prepare ye the way of the Lord. What was John the Baptist doing? He's preparing the way of the Lord. Absolutely. And this really kind of segues into the second coming, because look what he says: the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. Has anyone seen the Lord? But who will see the Lord at the second coming? All flesh will see the Lord. Okay. Malachi 3, verses 1 and 2. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant, in whom ye delight in, behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. But who may abide the day of his coming? Behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. It's talking about, of course, the first coming, but then it talks about the idea of the second coming. All right? So I think we got one last one. Yeah, one last one. Let's go ahead and do this, and then we'll start in the rest of it. In Luke 1, verses 31 through 33. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. First coming, right? That's after he came the first time. All right. So, question on the next page is: did you have difficulty with some of these? Some of it, yeah. Some of it you think, okay. Some of it makes sense. Of course, we're looking at it in hindsight. Remember that. We're looking at it when we have the law, we have all of the Bible, and we read it and we think, okay, yeah, some of that has to do with the first one. I can see that, the idea of, behold, they shall conceive and bear a son and all that. But some of that was that second coming or is that the first coming? I don't know. I'm not real sure. Well, the hypothetical question: if you were a Jew living in the year 100 BC, would you have understood these passages? Some, you may have had even more difficulty, because remember, at that point there was so much misinformation floating around about the church. Some of it with the best of intentions, people who were they were truly desiring to understand. But some of it, remember, there are going to be false teachers. They're going to come in and they're not going to spare the flock. They're going to come in and intentionally to pull you away. They're going to say things that are not true. So you have these people who are sitting there reading the law, which most people had access to. They could read the law, but they're reading it and they're saying, okay, I can understand that, but what is he talking about here? Remember the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip catches up with him and he says, do you understand what you're reading? And what was the Ethiopian eunuch's response? Yeah, I don't know. Who's this man he's speaking of? Is this him? Is he speaking of himself? Is he speaking of another person? So this is someone who's right there. Thankfully, he was right next to someone who was inspired by the Spirit of the Lord and instructed him exactly in what he needed to know. But what about those who were just reading this and didn't have that access? It would be difficult sometimes to understand some of these things. So it would have been hard to understand whether he's talking about one coming. Is there a first coming and a second coming? Is there only one coming? Has the first coming already been here and now the second coming is ways away? How does this work? Where are we in this? So it would have been very difficult. All right? So Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. He asks a question. I'm trying to put there. Okay. It's kind of a rhetorical question. The idea of the answer is kind of understood. But when you ask that question, ask it in a sincere way to somebody. Ask them that sincerely. What will it profit you if you gain the entire world but lose your soul? Or what shall a man... I like the second part of it because it kind of condenses it. What will a man give for his soul? That's really what it boils down to. What would a man give for his soul? All right, so there's a serious question. Which is worth more to us? The world, that all that it offers, or our eternal soul? Well, of course it does. Absolutely. You know why? We're thinking with right mind. We're thinking in a Christ-like fashion. But the world, in its avarice and its greed, would very quickly sell its soul. And many people already have. They already have. They've sold their soul. Now, can their soul be redeemed? Of course, that's why Christ came. Of course their soul can be redeemed. There's nothing that's insurmountable until we pass from this life and have not made that change, made that determination to repent. But even up until the day of our death, Christ can still redeem a soul no matter what we've sold it for, because he loves us. And God doesn't want anyone to perish. If that's what it takes, that's what he'll do to redeem our soul from whatever it is we've sold it for. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you denying yourself? The Lord will understand that, but He deals with that thing.
Yeah.
To those Christians, and a lot, unfortunately, a few fall for it.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I've found that some people will even throw the blame on God. I've read. I've never talked to anybody. I hope nobody ever says this to me face to face. But I've had people say, I don't think God really wants me to settle down with one person. I think He wants me to, He would if why would the old saying, why would He have made me with these desires if He didn't want me to fulfill these desires? That is a very real mindset and attitude for a lot of people. I believe God loves me, and I think He cares for me, and I think and they blame God. That's basically blaming God for a life of avarice and lust and greed and whatever it might be. It is. It's sad, and Christians are we're still human. We still make mistakes, and that's certainly one of them. Okay, so anyway, how can a person? What would you trade it for? The world, or what is worth more to you? The world and all that it offers, or your own soul? How can a person lose his own soul? Well, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, it tells us that, doesn't it? He will repay us according to what He has done. So how can we lose our soul? By our works, by doing the things. That's how we show our faith. That's how we show our lack of faith, is by what we do. The physical things that we do, the words that come out of our mouth, the deeds that we do, that's what shows whether we are faithful or unfaithful. If we're faithful, what is it? And it even tells us here what's going to happen. For the Son of Man is going to come with His angels in the glory of His Father, and then He will repay who? Each person. Does that exclude anyone? Is there a single person that's going to escape judgment in some way, shape, or form? The highest of the high, the kings of the world, the presidents, the rulers, the entertainers, all of those people, everybody that we've seen their name in lights and they've thought that they were the best thing in the world, they thought they were the greatest thing in the world, are they going to escape judgment? No. They're going to stand before God the same as the lowest of the low, and they're going to have to give an account. And what does it say? He says we're going to do two things. There's two things that Christ is going to do. When He comes, He is going to what? Reward and judge. And what comes first? Do we get a reward before we're judged? No. First, we're going to be judged, and we're going to be judged. And this is the. It's kind of the great thing. It's also kind of a scary thing. Is that God is going to be able to see. Christ is going to be able to see everything. Everything is going to be laid out there. We can't hide anything. You can try to cheat the IRS, and you can get away with it. I know people who hadn't paid taxes in 20 years. They make plenty of money. They're not paying taxes. Can you get away with theft? Sure. You can get away with murder. You can get away with anything under the sun, basically anything under the sun. And you know what? There are people who have done it in the light of day, and they know that they've done it, and they've escaped judgment. Nothing is going to escape the judgment of God. Nothing. That should give us some comfort. Because we see these people, and we see the way they behave, and then we see the way they act. We see their arrogance towards justice. We see their arrogance towards the people. And guess what? They're going to have to stand before God and receive a true, the fairest judgment that could possibly ever be handed out, because God is a fair God. Yes. Absolutely. Like I said, it should give us a sense of pleasure, a sense of comfort that God is going to be fair with us. He's going to be a just God. Okay? He's not going to falsely accuse us. He's not going to render anything unto us that we are not deserving of. So it should both make us feel better, and it should also what? Cause us to Absolutely. 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 Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely. hmm They're fooling themselves. Yeah, they've talked themselves into. They convinced themselves. Yeah. Are we going to say what again? Yes. That's done. That's as if it never happened. That's the beautiful thing about it. That's what I'm saying. We can take comfort in it because when God says, I forgive, and He has that ability to not only forgive it, but I will. He says that, and He says that He doesn't couch that in hidden language. He says very specifically, I will remember it no more. That gives us, if you can't breathe a sigh of relief from hearing that, I'm so thankful. I mean, and I look back on my life and I think, I fall into that trap. I've never really done anything that was that bad. Well, that's a dangerous way to think. I haven't done anything that bad. At least I'm not like this tax collector. But you know what? I can't do that. I have to look at it and say, you know what? If I've lied, if I've cheated in some way, if all of these things, I fall into that same condemnation. But luckily, when I repent and I gain that forgiveness, it says He doesn't remember it anymore. So what does it mean? We're going to have to go and we're going to have to do that. What He's going to do is He's going to say, this was your life. I think people look at it as we have to stand up there and we stand in a docket and we have to read all of these things off, and He asks, how do you plead? That's not what it is. When we get there, the decision is already made, is it not? So basically, what is He saying? You've been found wanting, or you've been found acceptable. There's no long, lengthy trial or anything like that. It's you know where you are when you die. So, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. When if you look at Jesus' example of the rich man and Lazarus, when it says that rich man died, what does it say? He woke up where? He woke up in torment. He knew where he was. He knew where he was. He knew where he was going to be, and he knew what his fate was. So this idea of having to stand there and the life goes up and you have to answer for all these things, when you get there, you know where you are. It's a simple matter of a formal enter ye in or depart from me. That's it. That's it. And you know what? It's one of those things. We have the right to a speedy trial in this country. That's about as speedy as it gets. The judgment's already been rendered. Your deeds are what get you. No, there is no appeal. No parole, no appeal, no anything. It's there you are. Okay, so let's drop down to this prediction. We understand that the Lord's first coming was necessary to set things right in man's heart, to establish that method, that communication between God and man that had been lacking, that it always had to go through a priest and a high priest. We no longer have that. Here He is to set His second coming, though, is necessary to destroy the world of man. It's to bring an end, and that's really what it's for. It's to bring an end to that which has gone on before this time. That's it. Okay? So, with this understanding, with this background, we can examine this prediction that He gives in 16 verse 28. It says, there will be those standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. Now, there are some misconceptions about that verse. What are some of the misconceptions? I heard one time that people believed that there were still immortal beings, that they were granted immortality at this point, and they would still exist and they still live and walk amongst us, and they're waiting for the second coming. Now, does that make sense? No, that, like I said, that's one of the more far out ideas. I mean, you think about that. No, of course, that can't be right. Who were standing there and listening to these words of Jesus? Okay, His disciples. Who were His disciples? The apostles were some other people that were following Him. Okay, all right. So, what would some of these men see before they would see death? Pentecost, coming of the church, right? Day of Pentecost. That's what He's talking about here in verse 28. He says, until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. So what is this kingdom that they're talking about? The church. It is the church. All right. Today it's been more than 1,900 years. Well, close to 2,000 years since He spoke these words. Now, Christ has not yet returned to earth to establish His kingdom. Is that true or false? It's false. It's absolutely false. Christ has established his kingdom. The kingdom was established on the day of Pentecost. Like I said, some of this is from another Bible study, and I don't agree with it. He has come to establish his kingdom. Did he come physically to establish his kingdom? No. Yeah, he has not yet returned physically. He has not yet returned physically or returned in the spirit to receive his kingdom to himself. No, he has not. But has his kingdom been established? Absolutely. All right? So, let's look at this idea of the transformation. That's all I really want to do in the prediction. But here's the transformation. About a week after the Lord's mysterious prediction, Jesus took 3 of his disciples with him to a mountain. That's what we find in chapter 17 of Matthew. The transfiguration. Now, on at least 2 other occasions, Jesus drew these 3 men apart to be with himself. Why do you think that was so? Why these 3 men in particular? They were. He has 12 men around him. He's probably going to get closer emotionally with some more than others. It doesn't mean that he loved others any less. It was just simply, these were ones that maybe he had conversations with that maybe he didn't have with the others. These might have been the 3 that were with him constantly, that were with him all the time. These other men, they had families. Okay, they were married with children, and at some point you got to go home to your wife and kids. That can get a little troublesome if you just decide, well, I'm giving up everything. I'm going to follow this guy around. No, these men still had responsibility. So they weren't all with him all at one time, but it's possible that these 3 men were with Jesus on more of a regular basis. They stayed with him a lot more often. All right? So we don't understand, the mountain, of course, is not identified. It just says that it was a high mountain, right? In 17 verse 1. It was a high mountain, and it was what? It was high and what? Holy. It was a holy mountain. So it likely was a place that had been used by God in the past in some way, shape, or form to communicate with his people. But he goes up on this place, and why did Jesus go up on the mountain? What was the reason to go up? He went to be alone. This time he took 3 people with him. Why do you think they may have gone? It says that oftentimes he would go up on the mountain to pray, right? He would go apart from himself to pray. All right. He had a reason for these 3 men. It could be that, like I said, these were the 3 that he chose to reveal this to before the rest of them. It could be that he wanted them to receive a special type of instruction. It doesn't say why in particular these 3, but they were ones that they were with him more often than not anyway. What time of the day did the Lord pray? What time of the day did the Lord often pray? Evening time. That's right. When the sun had gone down, he would go and he would pray. He would go off to himself and he would pray, and that's oftentimes when he would do that. All right. So while they were on the mountain in Luke 9 verse 32, somebody want to read that with me? Luke 9 verse 32. Went there. That's right. In Luke 9 verse 28, it says why Jesus. I don't keep saying God. Why Jesus went to the mountain, he went there to pray. And in Luke 9:32, while they were on the mountain, the disciples engaged in what kind of activity? Luke 9:32, what does it say? Okay. All right. So it was later in the evening. They were nodding off, maybe. Kind of customary. The people back then were not night owls, and you understand that, don't you? Right? When the sun goes down, you go to bed, because when it came up, you got up and you did your work. Okay. So when did they return from the mountain? Luke 9 verse 37. Okay. The day after they were on there. All right. So when would we say that the transfiguration of Christ took place? In the evening. After it would be true evening, after 6 o'clock in the evening. That's the end of the day, basically. So it would be sometime after 6 o'clock. So the sun is going down and it's dark, which is kind of important when you realize, when you see some of the things that are going to happen. All right? So what really happened to the Lord there on the mountain? I'm going to go ahead and turn there. I hate to keep asking people to read that. Luke 9. Okay. So what would that have made more difference in the morning time when it's, or in noon when it's bright sun outside, or would it be a far greater significance at dark in the evening? The evening time. Okay. The idea here is that one thing is that's true. What does it say about what are we? We're the light of the world. Light upon a hill cannot be hidden. A lot of symbolism there, right? Some things that you got to think a little bit deeper on. Okay. So hold on a second. Let me get where I am. All right. So we understand in Luke 29 it says that his. Let's just read it. Rather than jumping around. Now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him. Now it specifically names these 2 men. These were not men who resembled or were representative of Moses and Elijah. It says that these men were Moses and Elijah. There's no confusing them. Now, how would his apostles have known that this was Moses and Elijah? It would have been, they would have had, it would have had to been revealed to them. All they would have done is seen these 2 men. Somehow, God made it clear to these 3 men. They're standing there, and what their reception of this was. Their jaws dropped. They can't believe what's happening. I would imagine that living with Jesus day after day after day would have probably allowed them to handle some things. But there were some things that he did that must have been still jaw dropping. Well, now here he is with these 2 men. What significance did Moses and Elijah have to Peter and James and John? What was the significance of these 2 men? There were no 2 greater men in the law. Even Abraham. I mean, Abraham was a significant man, but this idea that through Moses the law was given, and through Elijah there was the prophecy. These 2 men, there was no greater, higher place of honor or prominence than these 2 men. So this was a significant event in their lives. It could have been. The thing about it was that the Jews were forbidden from making images. So if they did, now that's not to say they weren't, because remember there were those who believed in them that were not of that faith that could have done that and seen some sort of a representation. Don't know. But in any case, what does it say? It says they appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. So what are they discussing? His death. They're discussing his death and his eventual resurrection and ascension. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake and saw his glory, or when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Okay, they were heavy with sleep. They're kind of it seems like they're always getting dragged somewhere to pray with Jesus, and they fall asleep. But here they are. They're about to fall asleep, and all of a sudden this happens, and it's just their eyes are just they're awestruck. And as the men were parting from him, so their conversation, their discussion over what's going to happen to him is about to an end. And these 2 men are making a departure, likely to never come back to this, never have this ever happen again. It's the only instance we ever see where this occurs. So, of course, what happens? Peter says to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here." Well, of course it was good. He's just speaking platitudes here. Yes, of course it's good that we're here. It's good that you're anywhere with Christ. But what does he say? Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Now, not knowing what he said. Now, what is Peter trying to accomplish? He's trying to get them to what? Stay here. They're getting ready to depart. He said, well, hold on, before you, hey, don't leave so quick. Let's make a tent. Let's make a booth. In some translations it says tabernacle, a dwelling place. It's a temporary dwelling place. let's pitch a tent so they don't have to go so quick. Make them stay a little bit longer. Let's spend some more time with these men, because this is a man. These are in the upper echelon of our faith, and the opportunity to get to speak to these men and to stand there with them and to be a part of their, and to be fellowshipping with them must have been, it's a once in a lifetime occurrence. Not knowing that, guess what? They're going to get to fellowship with them for eternity. They didn't understand that. Okay, I tell you what, we're a little bit past time. Let's go ahead and finish up, and then we'll pick this up next week. We might get finished with it next week. Maybe. No rush. Anybody got any questions? Yeah. Sure. And the idea here, Peter, of course, is thinking about, from a very selfish, and not in a bad way, but a selfish standpoint. These are great men. I don't want them to go away. I want them to stay. And it says not understanding what he was saying. You think they were in a hurry to get back? Hey, I just got out of this place. I'm ready to go back. I want to go back to a house not made with hands. I don't want one that Peter's made. No matter how skillful he might be at building a tent, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go back. I'm ready to go back. I want to go back to be with God. Which kind of gives us a little bit of a lesson ourselves. The idea of, should we be in a hurry to hang around on this earth? Should we leave no stone unturned in order to remain here? No. We should not necessarily in a rush, but we should not turn down the opportunity to go and be with God. Uh-oh. Are you going to be with God?
What are you talking about? Well, I said, you don't have a message. I'll be here if God will.
All right.
Well, the doctor said, no, I have a special connection. I just laughed at it. He got a special connection of making sure that I'm here in my next appointment.
I got you. But there are people who they will do everything on earth to avoid death, and as Christians, that's not something we fear. We don't worry about it. I'm not saying rush out and try to find some way to die. That's not what I'm saying. But when my choice, even Paul said, I'm torn between staying here in this earthly tabernacle or shedding this earthly body to go and be in my true form with my God. And he says, I really want to go home. I really want to go home, but the church still needs me. I'm still needed here, and I'll stay as long as I'm needed, as long as God allows me to. And God allowed him to live until he didn't need him here anymore, and the church was where it needed to be, and then he took him. And I know he's glad to be where he is. Moses and Elijah are glad to be where they are. All of these people that have died before us are glad to be where they are in the church. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. Okay. Well, we'll offer the invitation if there's anyone here who needs the prayers of the congregation, whatever need you might have, whether it's to repent of sin or whether it's an issue that's going on in your life you need us to pray for, we want to do that. But if you have that need, if you need the prayers of the congregation, please come while we stand and while we sing.